So good morning, everyone, and welcome to CSIS. I'm Matt Pearl. I'm Director of the Strategic Technologies Program here at CSIS. So thank you to everyone for joining us, both in person and online. So we're here, in cyberspace, technology is the terrain, right? Every application, device, network, software dependency becomes part of the environment across which attackers move, and across which defenders must understand, monitor, and protect. AI is often discussed as a tool that will enable attackers to move more quickly and effectively across that terrain, mapping networks, scaling reconnaissance, finding vulnerabilities, and conducting increasingly sophisticated operations. So that's the attacker side of things, and I won't deny that those risks are real. Advanced tools can expand the number of attackers because less sophisticated attackers have access to these tools. And it can also aid sophisticated adversaries to operate with much greater scale and scope. So that's, as I said, that's the offensive side of things. But I think that and we're here because AI's defensive potential is much more profound than giving defenders just the same tools or comparable tools that attackers have. AI creates the possibility of transforming the terrain itself, mapping networks, making them more observable, making malicious activity harder to conceal, and making systems faster to repair. So the opportunity that we have is to move from defending largely passive terrain to actively building and constructing digital environments that can increasingly sense, adapt, and participate in their own defense. So what would this transformation in cyber defense look like? AI can help organizations monitor systems continuously instead of periodically. It can enable them to identify patterns across enormous volumes of data that humans would be unable to detect. It can help distinguish the most serious vulnerabilities from the noise. It can accelerate investigation and response. And it can enable defenders to apply insights across many systems at once. So that could begin to change the underlying geometry of cybersecurity if we implement it correctly. Attackers have traditionally benefited from being able to search broadly for a single vulnerability or a single opening, while defenders have had to protect sprawling, complex, changing environments. AI offers defenders the ability to observe more of that environment, investigate more signals, and address more vulnerabilities simultaneously. But none of this means that the defensive advantage will arise automatically. This outcome is not foreordained. Our competitors are moving and adversaries are moving at machine speed to operationalize AI capabilities, which means that we have a critical window to harden our digital infrastructure, and that window is narrowing. But that should be a source of both urgency and optimism. AI does not inevitably favor attackers. Properly deployed, it can give us a genuine opportunity to reshape the contest in favor of defenders. Realizing that potential will require much more than providing cybersecurity teams with access to increasingly capable models. Although I would note that access, if we've been watching the news, that's also an issue that we should discuss. But beyond access, and ensuring that our allies and partners and trusted companies all have access to the most advanced models. When AI identifies a vulnerability, an organization must still be able to determine whether the finding is accurate, assess its significance, identify affected systems, develop and test a fix, and deploy it without disrupting essential operations that they're conducting. So the models must be integrated into trusted workflows that allow people and institutions to act on what they find. We will also need to ensure that these capabilities reach beyond the best resourced companies. Access alone is not enough. Capability without capacity will not secure our digital infrastructure. And so policy must not only make AI-enabled defenses more broadly available, it must also help organizations to integrate and operate them. Things like shared services, technical assistance, workforce training, and other types of support for implementation. Our national cybersecurity posture depends on open source software, small and medium-sized businesses, local governments, utilities, and other critical infrastructure operators that may lack resources and expertise. So transforming the terrain at its strongest point will not be enough to secure our digital infrastructure if our most consequential vulnerabilities remain exposed. That's why this conversation today cannot be only about capability. It must be about implementation. These are things like procurement reform, public-private coordination, testing and evaluation, vulnerability disclosure, and the institutions and what those institutions need to do in order to translate technical expertise into stronger security. So the Trump administration's recent executive actions have set up some of the vital work that we need in terms of establishing a baseline, for instance, for federal networks. And we're very fortunate to have Mike Duffy, the acting CISO for the federal government here to talk about some of those actions. So today's discussion is intended to set up precisely that conversation about implementation work. We're very grateful to be joined by an august group of senior government as well as industry and think tank scholars. Our first panel is going to examine what has changed in the relationship between AI and cybersecurity and what some of those implications are. And our second panel will turn toward what government, industry, and the broader cybersecurity community can do in order to seize this defensive opportunity that I was talking about and build a more resilient digital infrastructure. So thanks again for joining us. And it's my pleasure to welcome the first panel, which will be moderated by Lauren Williams, our Deputy Director and Senior Fellow in the Strategic Technologies Program. So thank you.
Okay, so again, echoing Matt's thanks to all of you. We're really glad to have such a great group here in the room and for our listeners online as well. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. And so as previewed, we are going to kick off today's conversation with an incredible group of current government leaders, as well as former government leaders, industry leaders, academic leaders, all represented here on the stage today. And what we're going to dive into is how we as a cybersecurity community, an AI community, a national security community, should be thinking about the current moment in AI and cyber defense and the extent to which it is an inflection point across those policy communities. And so the core of a forthcoming report that CSIS will be releasing and that we'll draw on some of the themes on today is that AI doesn't automatically favor either side, whether offensive actors or defensive actors, but it may dramatically increase the speed and scale of cyber attacks. And it also creates, as we discussed, heard from Matt, it creates the possibility of a fundamentally more resilient defensive posture, one that's characterized by continuous monitoring, rapid detection, machine speed response, and persistent system hardening. But the way to get to that outcome is through coordination and action, to allow AI to transform US cyber defenses by giving defenders a variety of new tools and the ability to move at machine speed to detect and evaluate vulnerabilities, to evaluate attack patterns, and remediate and recover in response. So again, this first panel is going to focus on where we are today, understanding it from the perspective of all of the experts here on the stage, diagnosing the current challenges that we're facing, and answering some of the key questions that are out there today. So without further ado, I'm really excited to be joined by an incredible group of experts And I'll just walk through highlights from their incredible bios. So with us today, to my left, we have Mr. Mike Duffy, who is the acting federal chief information security officer for the federal government and sits within the White House Office of Management and Budget, and where he's responsible for driving cybersecurity policy development and adoption, overseeing strategy alignment and implementation efforts, and ensuring cyber program improvement and maturation across the whole of the federal government. Thanks for joining us, Mike. And then next we have Ms. Mika Oyang, who is a national security policy expert and has been for a long time, having previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for cyber policy during the entirety of the Biden administration, where in that role she was the senior civilian responsible for cyber and electronic warfare strategy at the DoD, aligning cyber strategy for offense and defense within our broader national defense and national security strategies. Before her service in the executive branch, she also served on Capitol Hill and has been and is a recognized think tank leader in developing policy and strategy in these areas. I can go on and on about all of our experts, but I'll move next to Ms. Nicole Isaac, who is Vice President for Global Public Policy at Cisco, where she leads a team of experts that drive Cisco's policy agenda around the world and to enable Cisco's mission. And before Cisco, Nicole also spent decades in government and in various corporate leadership roles. She served at Google, Meta, and LinkedIn, and also in the Obama administration on Capitol Hill, working with both Vice President Joe Biden, then President Biden, and President Obama. And then last but not least, we have Mr. Jay Gasley, who is joining us from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, where he's the acting associate director for vulnerability management and manages the vulnerability ecosystem and the coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. Before CISA, he served in the private sector as a technical director at Acuity Inc., managing a team of engineers, and has also served many years at the Department of State as a senior principal engineer and in other important roles. And since 2020, he has been serving on the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures CVE board. So, all right, I have a lot of questions, and I'm going to dive right into them because of the range of experience that we have on this stage. So just to start with a question, to go around the room, around the panel, so to speak, I wanted to kick off our conversation by asking, from all of your perspectives, and we can start with Mike, what, in your view, has changed the most? And I originally asked the question as 12 to 18 months, but I'd also ask even more closer in than that, in the last several months, in the relationship between AI and cybersecurity. And what do you think that policymakers, maybe or from your perspective, people outside of the policy community, need to help them improve their understanding about this current moment?
Well, thanks for having me, Lauren, and good to see everyone. I'd say first and foremost, you're right, 12 to 18 months in this field is an enormous span. I'll say that first and foremost, it is just the fact that we've gone probably in 12 months to hypothetical, how could AI use cases, what could we explore when it comes to AI in mission operations, have gone from those hypotheticals to experimental use cases to now kind of an operational reality of where we are in both the federal government, with private sector, with missions across the nation. That's a massive leap. I think it's also a reminder that we are long past the point of contemplating what is next. What should be our next move? I think this is a great opportunity and a great panel to have the discussion of where we see this going. But if we wait long, it's too late. And I think that when I'm looking back, you mentioned some of the recent executive orders from the White House, binding operational directives from CISA, new OMB policy to set the stage for where the government is going when it comes to artificial intelligence and cyber defense. That's really important. The last decade of federal cyber policy has primarily been shaped by major and significant incidents of the past 10 years. We've gotten really, really good at finding ways to pick up the pieces after something happens, start putting them together and say, that's never going to happen again. We've figured out the issue, we've resolved it, and we've built a process to ensure that doesn't happen once more. We know now that we don't have the luxury of that time to wait to see what happens. We have to act now to ensure that we've taken requisite steps to move the country forward, to move the federal government forward, to ensure those mechanisms where we would typically say, because this happened, let's take these specific actions. We need to be decisive right now. This is a moment for the government, for industry, this community to really act decisively to ensure that we aren't waiting for the next disaster to happen. We need, and this is the message to both policymakers, to this community, to keep that in mind. We aren't waiting for something to happen for us to act. We need to have that same energy that we put in to the aftermath of those significant incidents of the past. We need to have that mindset now. We need to ensure that we are resourcing, we're focused, we're streamlining operations in a way that allow us to move forward confidently, knowing what is likely to happen if we don't. And I think that is the message that I come with today, which is ensuring that we don't feel like we have to wait for something for it to be real. This is something that we're seeing in reality. This is a new operational reality. It's important that we front load planning to ensure that we're ready for that day.
Thanks very much, Mike. Mika, your perspectives?
Yeah, I think that this moment has really demonstrated, especially with the release of the Mythos class models, that cybersecurity, or AI's defensive potential for cybersecurity is tremendous, right? We're all aware of the cyberpocalypse, the idea that we are going to have to patch more than we ever expected to. The demand for high quality cyber staff is huge. And it really, I think, needs to upend some of our assumptions about how cyber worked in the past. One of the things that we always worried about was there were never enough qualified cyber personnel. But AI can help us relieve the burden of having those giant shortages of personnel where skilled cyber engineers can manage workflows of AI and get a lot more done. So all of this tech debt that we have been saddled with for generations, we can really begin to address that. The challenge really, I think, is understanding the cost of that compute and how do we make sure that it is actually reaching all the enterprises where we need to have it go. Because Project Glasswing made very clear that like large enterprises that are well-resourced had first crack at this to be able to really understand what it is and to protect their adversaries. And this is good practice in cybersecurity to make sure that the defenders get a head start on the attackers. But what about the smaller and medium-sized businesses that may be doing B2B but may not have the access to the models to get ahead of things, who are much more vulnerable, I think, to the possibility of the attackers using AI against them. And then the other thing that I think is a real challenge in this moment, which is not about the capability of AI itself, but how we as a government, as the United States as a government, reacts to the release of these models. The back and forth with Anthropic about Mythos, the sort of release and then pullback, it was very clear that we don't have a good way as a government to say, we're okay with this and now we're going to go forward to release. And what that has done is really shaken the confidence of a lot of large enterprises about the reliability of the US technology offerings. And so I get that Mythos was a moment and it's a very different recognition of the cybersecurity risk. But going forward, we need to make sure that the American technology offerings are more reliable, because I have heard from many companies around the world that they are beginning to doubt, like, if I'm going to make this investment, is it still going to be there for me? Or is someone going to discover something later and this tool that I've built a workflow on gets yanked away suddenly and without a lot of warning? And we just need to make sure that we as a partner in technology are more reliable than that.
No, I really appreciate that perspective. It's not just about the technology, but it's about the response across sectors. So we'll dig into this a little bit later as well. And Nicole, from the industry perspective.
I think from the industry perspective, we're seeing a number of things. One, with the release of Mythos, you have an increase in the number of organizations, entities, as well as governments seeking access to these models. And our response has been, you don't necessarily need access to Mythos for purposes of securing your ecosystem, your community, for securing what is needed on the ground. And frankly, given some of the open source technology that's out there, just recognizing that baseline security, cybersecurity protocols are essential for really meeting many of these governments, many of these countries where they currently are. And I know Jay and I spoke about this a little bit earlier. It's recognizing that not everyone who even has access to Mythos has the capacity to harness it. And that actually is even more problematic in this landscape and in this ecosystem right now. I think from a Cisco perspective, we've said it's kind of like driving a Ferrari to Trader Joe's, which you would not do. We wouldn't recommend that. And in fact, especially if you've only previously rode a bike there, you have to recognize that you have the requisite technology and capability right now for your ecosystem to do what's needed. And so jumping ahead and trying to be where you're not is only going to be even more problematic. And that's where we try to recommend balance. At the same time, it really is about inclusivity and going beyond just the countries, the organizations, the enterprises, and the entities that have access, but making sure that we're being foundational about critical infrastructure and the necessary sectors that have to have security. And so this goes back to managing technical debt, managing infrastructure that is frankly outdated, ensuring that you are addressing that from a capacity perspective, because that's going to be one of the first sources of vulnerability that needs to be addressed.
No, I think you make one of the critical points, Nicole, which is that we have to be, and I think the panel would agree, we have to be focused on the cybersecurity fundamentals first, and then secondarily think about how these new models have changed that landscape. So maybe to you on that, Jay, and from a vulnerability management perspective, curious how you see this landscape.
No, and thank you. One of the pleasures of my job is I run a team of penetration testers who are out in federal infrastructure and U.S. critical infrastructure every day. And what we've seen for the last multiple decades is we have nearly at-will access using standard processes that are available to every attacker, to most water, community infrastructures, power infrastructures that we engage with. And it isn't because of boutique vulnerabilities that are being found in code. It isn't because of amazing capabilities that Mythos provides. It's because organizations don't do the basic patching. They haven't been able to do it already. And once you get in, living off the land is the easiest collection of TTPs you could ever imagine. They are scripted and they are learnable by everybody in this room in just a few hours. So given that we already have a soft and porous infrastructure, when we have this amazing accelerant of AI, and these models are amazing, they are super fun, my team is having a great time learning so many things, it's great. But then last weekend, I downloaded a new kit on my laptop, and I pulled an API key for GLM 5.2. It's the newest Chinese model. It is amazingly effective. Like it really took my breath away when I compared it to what I have with Mythos. What I have from these open source Chinese models was stunning. And it makes me think that we have to be really thoughtful about what the other policy processes that are going to secure us. Because ultimately, a lot of critical infrastructure today is secured by the threat of FBI prosecuting them. It's not secured by the fact that the infrastructure is secure. It's secured by the fact that they're afraid that DOD or DOJ or State Department is going to sanction another country. So that whole interagency policy process is what ultimately secures a lot of our critical infrastructure, and it's why it's so important as we have these massive changes to the technical capabilities of ourselves and others that we engage the totality of government to protect our way of life.
Absolutely. So really helpful set of framing comments, and I'm debating which way I want to go and which threads I want to pick up on. So I think maybe I'll start by zooming out a little bit, and we've already talked about, and you just raised as well, Jay, this context of competing or maybe comparative even Chinese models and how those should maybe be shaping how we think about actions here from a U.S. government, U.S. industry, U.S. cyber ecosystem perspective. So maybe I'll go first to Mika, and maybe then Mike, and Nicole, if you want to get on this as well. But how should the public be thinking about the context when it comes to U.S.-China cyber technology, AI competition, the models that are open source or are easily available? And I think you raised this point already, Mika. The possibility that international partners maybe are going to be looking at these capabilities as the federal government is determining the direction that we want to go. in terms of governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a national security person, I've always looked askance at Chinese technology products, just knowing a little bit too much about the ways in which the government likes to take advantage of technology products. But there is something about this, this new class of models and their ability to find cyber vulnerability, both in the open source Chinese models that people can run wherever, but also in the US proprietary models, that should change our calculus a bit on how we think about risk coming from Chinese technology products. Because when we worry about that cyber risk coming from Chinese technology products, our assumptions have been based around a couple of scenarios. One is the idea that somehow the Chinese government is pressuring these companies to nefariously engineer in a secret backdoor that only they can use. And the other is that they might use a developer update channel to time and place later push an update that is malicious. And with the availability of these models, our ability to interrogate the security of the technology stack, we have to really question hard the first assumption, which is that if people are running Mythos-class models, whether they're US or Chinese, on the systems that are running, won't they be able to find those 0 days? Could someone really engineer in something, send it out into the wild, and have the trust that it would still be there when they wanted to take advantage of it? So that should change our calculus about what good cybersecurity looks like. It's not necessarily that it's secure when it's rolling off the line, because we all know all product has holes in it, and it's really a question of how you are dealing with those vulnerabilities that are found later. The American technology ecosystem is very experienced in dealing with this kind of ship first, patch later approach, and has created all kinds of systems to create transparency in how they address vulnerability. You know, paying for bug bounties, participating in CSIS vulnerability disclosures, Patch Tuesdays, incentivizing independent researchers. We have this whole ecosystem that says everybody is participating in cybersecurity. It's really a team sport. It's not just the company and the government. China, on the other hand, has these policies that undermine trust in their systems. They require disclosure of vulnerabilities to the government first. For what purpose? We don't know. Are they actually patching them? They discourage independent cybersecurity researchers. Some Chinese cybersecurity researchers who've identified these things have experienced some negative consequences. They don't incentivize this. Now, that makes no sense on a country that is also relying on open source technology stack, but they've not built the kind of transparency models that you would want to see in cybersecurity if they intend to be globally competitive and not just have all their technology products be tainted with being part of their national security enterprise. So we need to think differently about what good cybersecurity products look like. But the other thing that I think is happening with the Chinese models, because they are not very far behind the US at all, and I think we have no reason to assume that the Chinese people would not be able to engineer quality product, is what does that mean for enterprise? Because the US is constrained on power, which raises the cost of our compute, and China is not constrained on power, and so the cost of their compute is significantly lower. When you are an enterprise deciding which model to run, and you're looking at where am I getting best bang for my buck, you're seeing a lot of people look to Chinese models for compute-intensive tasks that are running at a lower level to try and lower their cost. So what does that mean if we have an integrated ecosystem? We can't assume that a US-only technology stack is going to be the winner from an economics perspective. And I think that's another thing that we need to think through in our policy development. What does that mean if we have technology stacks that enterprises, even American enterprises, are choosing that are blended? And so I think that there's a lot that we haven't really thought through yet about how we're going to deal with that.
No, that's really helpful, laying out the range of challenges. And obviously, Mike, you have the exciting, I'll characterize it that way, challenge of guiding the federal governments and shepherding the federal government's response to these significant changes and advancements from an AI perspective. So curious, following on from Mika's comments, how do you think about, how do you keep a focus on the US ecosystem, which is challenging enough, but also keep in mind advances that are taking place in China, for example?
It's a great question. I think the points are really something that we have to think about from a policy perspective. Kind of model agnostic, kind of aside from specific I think one thing that's concerning me is just the speed of change that we're seeing, the improvements that we're seeing in these models across the board. Something that, as I mentioned, if our policy and our requirements and our standards aren't keeping up, then we'll be left behind. And so really ensuring right now that we have seized the moment in that kind of narrowing window of being able to quickly pivot and adapt, to understand what we're seeing in these models, that their use across industry as both adversary and beneficial to the work that we're doing for cyber defense. It's important for us to think about the governance models we're using, the way that we're adapting our security controls, the way that we're considering response. With all of this at play, I think I'm less concerned about individual models as I am about the way that we address this risk management overall. And that's something that the federal government is working through right now. How can policy, how can governance structures, how can decision makers really understand what they're dealing with so they can prioritize the right kind of action?
Absolutely. And Nicole, any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, just one additional thought. I mean, from a cybersecurity perspective, we've really been focusing on the application layer. We're talking about open source models. We're talking about the technology that individuals, enterprises, and organizations are typically accessing for purposes of ameliorating whatever task that they need to do, but typically at the application layer. And I think it's just very critical that we understand that security needs to happen at every layer. And from a Cisco perspective, again, we do security by design at every layer, whether it's networking at the foundational infrastructure layer, ensuring that data, when it's transported across these networks, are secure in a manner that can't be compromised at the application layer. And so I would just encourage at every juncture, particularly when we're thinking about foreign adversaries and the ways in which they're very nuanced in their operation and compromise of this respective of the data that we are seeking to secure, that we do so in a holistic and comprehensive manner.
Absolutely. So Jay, if you have any other thoughts kind of on how you think about the parallel kind of China challenges, I'd be interested in hearing those as well. But I'm also curious your perspectives on kind of on the flip side of threat actors, kind of less sophisticated actors, and how we should be thinking about AI raising the bar.
I'll say it. So one of the things my team has done with one of the models is point it at a open source vulnerability that was recently disclosed in software that we all use. We pointed one of these frontier models at it for a weekend. Cost a lot of money in tokens, but we wanted to, it's a bit of a stunt hack, you know, what's going on here. And we took a unauthenticated vulnerability that was originally just going to cause the service to tip over, right? A very basic denial of service vulnerability. And over the course of the weekend, the output became a remote code execution race condition dependent on that class of hardware. So we took something that was kind of a boring vuln and turned it into a consistently useful remote code execution exploit, like durable and useful, which is designing that type of exploit is something you have a very expert, long-term human doing this work, creating that whole class of exploits. Race conditions are hard. Making them reliable is hard. And now they are able to be just done by a guy who works for me using a tool. That is a democratization of capability that I didn't expect to happen a couple of years. Like this was not on my radar 8 months ago. I didn't think this was going to happen. You add that to the ability to do these brute force chains of vulnerabilities that these new models can do. Also, didn't expect to see that 6 months ago. And so that has fundamentally changed the number of threat actors, and it has lowered the skill needed to vibe coding for top-tier exploit development in a non-lockdown model.
Now that you admitted that, I think we have some friends at the fort who are going to be coming after your guys to like hire them.
I mean, I don't know that they need to because, again, I think we could have most of the people in this room with these models doing some of that work in a pretty short time frame.
So we're starting to pivot, but I think mostly have been laying out the possibilities or the opportunities, I guess, for this democratization of offensive cyber actions and just the challenges that we face from a policy and a coordination standpoint. But of course, we are here today, and the optimism that we want to be focused on is the opportunity for AI-enabled cyber defense on the flip side. And so maybe starting from where you left off, Jay, curious within your team and going forward, and I know that CSIS has also put out some recent guidance around these issues as well. How do you think about the opportunities for vulnerability remediation, for instantiating, for infusing AI-enabled kind of defensive operations to help defend our critical infrastructure?
Well, this is where it's fun, too, because we now have the ability to interrogate the software we're already running, find out what the problems are, and fix them at speed. It is amazing for me to be able to tell a department and agency, hey, you have this open source package, here's a vulnerability in it, oh, here's a fix. It's in the same language, it's in the same style of code, you just need to merge this, test it, and run it. Oh, wait, you have AI in your build pipeline? You can build test scenarios to validate this without having to spend time with humans working on this and use that same brute force power that an AI model offered to discover the vulnerability, to then check the vulnerability, to check the patch and ensure that the outcome is what you want it to be with a good test scenario. That's super cool. And that means that everybody is going to be building more reliable and safer software. It's going to be a hard transition, but if we use these tools to build better software, we're going to have more time to ensure the quality is right and to learn from each other what the right test scenarios are and be able to validate in a non-deterministic world. It's going to be great. It's going to be a couple of years.
So a gap in time you're noting. Nicole, maybe to you from your perspective, kind of where are you seeing the greatest demand for AI-enabled cyber defensive tools? Maybe looking out on the industry side of things, and I think Mika raised earlier, and maybe multiple people raised earlier, that the focus from a Project Glasswing or a Daybreak perspective has been on kind of some of the largest, most important companies in the ecosystem, as well as the federal government. But of course, we need to be focused on spreading the availability of AI-enabled defensive tools to weaker parts of the ecosystem as well. So curious your perspectives on that.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. No, that's exactly right. I think let's just take a step back and start with the 2.2 billion individuals who are not connected to the internet, right? And so when you think about the ways in which these cyber challenges and these threat actors can impact those who are most vulnerable, that for us is very top of mind, ensuring that, again, at the networking layer, at every layer of the stack, once individuals are connected, you're creating a space by which you're protecting their data, you're protecting their information in a manner that is going to most drive outcomes and impact. I think more specifically to the question around where are we seeing this increase in demand, of course, I think everyone wants access to a Mythos type model, but we recognize that not everyone, one, has the harness capable of managing these models. Two, they don't necessarily need this model for purposes of addressing the vulnerabilities in their ecosystem. And from that perspective, it's really important that on these open source models, at minimum, we are, one, identifying the best practices for purposes of securing these models. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but making sure that, especially when legislation is being proposed either in Congress or for international standard harmonization around managing these models in a way that once you're accessing them, there's a baseline level of security that is offered. And I don't know how we continue to do that outside of some of the federal protocols that are needed, at least here, for making sure that anyone who is accessing these models from a US perspective, they have the basic infrastructure needed to address and protect their data. So that is what is most top of mind. And then, when we think about other countries, I think Mika noted it in your initial remarks, it's not just the organizations and enterprises that frankly are concerned about lack of availability of access when they need it, when those switches, may be shifted. It's countries that frankly, when they should be looking to US technology for understanding what they need to do to address, their constituents and to address some of the small businesses that are happening in XYZ country, it's also a challenge when they're looking to open source foreign adversary models, right? Because that compromises their data, and that puts us in an adverse position long-term in terms of national competitiveness. So that, for me, is very much top of mind, and I'm grateful to be on this panel with Mike and Jay, who are driving this forward from a federal perspective, because not only do we need critical collaboration and harmonization across the requisite organizations and entities, but we need clarity around best practices. We need clarity around how to effectuate, thank you. Too many words in my head at once. But clarity around how to best address this in a manner that is going to be most effective in the near term. Because as Mike noted at the outset, we don't really have time. I mean, the level at which these models are being able to detect information, the level at which you need to patch, the level at which it can correct what you're doing, it's just unprecedented. And so that's why it's even more important for us to work together, and really grateful for the partnership.
Absolutely. So a two-part question for Mike, and then we'll go to Mika as well. And it gets at kind of exactly what all of the panelists have been noting, and Nicole just now. There are huge obstacles to getting from where we are now to where, as Jay noted, we need to be in the future. But the challenges are here right now. So from your perspective, what are the biggest obstacles to making an AI-enabled defensive shift and expanding it holistically across, not just one federal network, but across the whole of government? And then second part to that question is how you think about maybe OMB's particular authorities when it comes to procurement, federal procurement, in helping enable that.
Great question. I think this is what makes all of what we've just discussed real. I think all of Jay's optimism about what could be coming if we were to leverage this appropriately, more secure software development, feed it into the CI/CD pipelines, all of that goodness comes down to the culture of the organization, the standard of the organization, the readiness of the organization, the understanding of the capability set that agency or organization team has is so critical to all of this. That's also where I mentioned before the last decade of policy serves as a foundation for us to at least take steps forward, massive steps forward in preparing for this moment. But it isn't sufficient for where we need to go. The status quo had very different operating assumptions that we need to adjust to where we are today. And that is where, when we're looking at organizational culture, a great example for this is if we're using models, or any models, to identify, discover vulnerabilities that an organization hadn't been tracking. It really is important for that organization that may be sprawling or siloed or has outdated procedures where a task gets bumped from one group to another. It's important for that to get streamlined immediately. For us to really be thinking about an organization, how an organization is designed and built for speed, because the speed that is necessary to address the risks that we're seeing now will introduce friction that requires a rethinking of the way that organization might currently be prioritizing its work or resources, the way that you are building security controls into that, the strategy of the organization moving forward, and a recalculation of how you think about risk. I was on a panel yesterday where I, in hoping to empower a group of CISOs, truly say this is the moment that CISOs, I think, have been waiting for. For so long, it's been just the security vertical that they are working through, and they're really trying to make a case for the rest of the mission. This is the topic that breaks loose that security mindset across all missions of an organization. It's impossible to do any of this work in a silo. And I think that is the interesting and should be compelling opportunity that we have ahead of us, which is the CISO has to be able to know the mission probably as well as anyone in that organization, certainly within a federal agency, to protect the data that is necessary against the threats that we're seeing, to ensure that you are operating with a kind of a higher level of risk management. This is the moment. This is really where CISOs need to be thinking more about the way that the organization operates, and if they aren't able to make progress in their security mission, this is really the time to shake things up. This is the governance challenge of a CISO's career journey that you have to figure out before AI starts putting them behind the curve. That's a really important message. You mentioned the constraints or the hurdles that organizations find. I think that's one of them. I think no one has built an organization to be sprawling and federated and complex, just kind of on the first draft of the org chart. This happens over time. So an organization finds itself in saying, I'll often talk to a CISO about patch velocity, and a CISO will say, of course we should patch faster. That isn't the question. The question is who in that life cycle, who in that stream is also responsible for taking these actions. You have to speak with them as well. And that's where the complexity of an organization, that governance framework that we need to build for today's risk environment is so vitally important. You mentioned the contracting, the procurement side of this. Another way that you can't be a CISO without having a good relationship with your chief procurement officer, with your legal officer, with the mission owners, the system owners within the organization. Procurement is such an important lever that both the government has as an enterprise to clearly articulate the expectations and requirements that we would have, whether it be secure development lifecycle or finding ways that we would expect a contractor or provider to patch or remediate at scale across our enterprises. This is a way that we can unify our voice as a federal government to say this is the expectation. We say it clearly. We can both support an individual agency in contract clauses or procurement actions, but more importantly, when that's done clearly at the federal level, we're able to protect that entire federal enterprise and oftentimes shape the way the market is seeing the need for security within its products. I think that's an important moment for us to think through right now. I mentioned I read a bit of your draft paper right now, which brought a lot of ideas to the forefront. One of them was this idea of what is the baseline requirement, either in contract clauses that we might place into federal contracts, could also be how we configure products once we have them. CISA has a fantastic program, Secure Cloud Business Applications, which has allowed federal agencies to look at how do we configure at a high hardened baseline the types of applications that we use across the board right now. So we can work with providers to ensure that they are taking the right steps to develop more secure code, to ensure fixes are coming out quickly and at scale, but we can also ensure that agencies are taking the necessary steps to configure those products right now to ensure that the most common vulnerabilities and challenges that we've seen across the federal government aren't hitting all agencies. This is something that we can bake those lessons learned into the guidance, the baselines, the expectations that we set forth, and that's an incredibly important step, an incredibly important role for the government through OMB, through our other partners in the interagency, to define, we've seen this happening somewhere, let's ensure that the enterprise is more secure because we know about it.
No, thanks a lot for that, Mike. And I think maybe one of the many themes or takeaways I have from what you just said is that maybe the way to frame the moment, and we've been talking about it, we, cybersecurity community, have been talking about it in context of kind of the fears or the challenges that new models introduce from an offensive perspective, but the opportunity for defenders, I think, is what you really highlighted, both from an industry perspective and for the federal government. So, Mika, your thoughts on this too?
I'm sorry, Mika, sorry to interrupt. I think that is an important takeaway, and one where we recently convened industry to have that conversation. Another hurdle, maybe a constraint, is there's a lot of marketing that is very challenging for an organization trying their best to cut through. And I think in this moment, there are really good AI-enabled cybersecurity defense tools out there in the market. We're using kind of the federal buying power, our central programs like continuous diagnostics and mitigation to explore ways to get those into the hands of agencies to ensure they have that kind of capability. We had conversations with industry recently at the White House to have conversations about what is most mature. Where can we expect to see the greatest advancements? What can we consider practically done and in operations, whereas other capabilities that we know we need are still kind of being developed? And that's an important distinction for us to understand. And frankly, it's an important conversation for us in a community to have because it can get really confusing. This is moving fast. We mentioned how much things have changed just in 12 months, 18 months. To understand what the market is providing, ensuring that we set the right expectations for our partners to develop this kind of capability, we have to have that open conversation. We have to ensure that we aren't getting caught in too much kind of marketing buzz, kind of slideware, to ensure that we're actually seeing results, actually seeing capabilities that matter and getting them into the hands of defenders.
Oh, no, that's fine. But I was thinking about Nicole's point about not everyone has the harness to be able to really take advantage of these models. And I think it's a really important point because we often over-focus on the models themselves and their capabilities, but the deployment architecture and the workflows that are built around them are also so important, and not everyone knows how to use them. It's like we have invented the internal combustion engine, and it is changing everything. But should every CISO also have to invent rack and pinion steering and suspension and tires? Because that's kind of how it feels right now, is that like we have the engine, but what are all the things that actually enable you to have that Ferrari really work as opposed to just being stuck on the bicycle? And as we think about how these workflows are developed, right, large enterprises, some of the hyperscalers are going to be able to build their own full scale, put it all together. But what is the smaller scale, right, not top 5 company in the United States going to do? Are they each trying to invent the thing themselves? Or is someone coming along and saying, I've put this package together for you, and here's your choice of a Camry or a Ferrari or or an airplane, depending on your use case. How do you build those workflows and harnesses together to help those people who can't actually figure out how to do that themselves, or maybe they just don't want the expertise in it? How do we make sure that there are people who are specializing in building that whole technology stack? And I think that right now we are so focused on just the models and should the models themselves come out, and we're not paying enough attention to what is the deployment architecture, what is the tooling that goes around these models, and how should defenders think about which tools make the most sense, what are purpose-built for them. And I will admit, I don't have a full insight into that entire marketplace, and things are getting developed now as the models come out. But it does feel like we are at the early stages of a maturing ecosystem, and I'm hopeful that for folks who are really mature in this and thinking about those things, they will figure it out for other people so that we can leverage that efficiency across the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right, Mika. And actually at Cisco, we built a model agnostic harness for purposes of individuals across the ecosystem to leverage it as they're using these models, right? And making sure, it's called Foundry Security Spec for anyone who's interested in looking at it, and happy to make sure we circulate it. But again, it's now available in the open source community because our goal is to make sure anyone, anywhere has the requisite tools to access information and access connectivity in a manner that is secure, wherever they are, because that is what is necessary for tomorrow's workforce, for tomorrow's future, and it has to be accessible by everyone. And I love the earlier point that you made on just kind of the sector-specific critical infrastructure. I just wanted to come back to that. For me, it's a question of where are we most vulnerable? And it's not only the small businesses, but when you think about outdated technology that's being utilized in healthcare, right, where you have fragmented systems sitting on infrastructure that frankly needs to be updated, that is now vulnerable, that is critical for purposes of securing data and information, that is absolutely important for every constituent across this country and across the globe. How do you prioritize, one, where we should be focusing an investment and making sure that we are addressing those vulnerabilities, but two, finding the best practices from an industry perspective. I know financial services, they have an amazing industry association and they're looking at all of this, but what about those sectors that don't necessarily have the requisite associations that's sharing the best practices, sharing the information on how to access these harnesses, how to access these models in a secure way, and how to best protect your community?
No, I think that's great. So I'm going to come back to Jay just on one of the questions that I'd posed to Mike a little bit earlier, which is about how to think about shifting to a posture of kind of active and persistent repair, AI-enabled defenses proliferated across the federal network space. So your thoughts on that, and then I'm going to ask a couple of kind of final lightning round questions for the whole panel.
Well, so repair is going to be interesting, right? Because it's that great tie-in between the security team and the operations team and contracting. It's the mucky stuff. It's the reason that we put out this new binding operational directive that talks about how you have to integrate the security team and the network operations team if you've got vulnerabilities that are known exploited on your edge devices, right? It's always been these friction points that our adversaries expose, these cultural problems. You see it in OT networks and IT networks, how the teams don't talk to each other. And these technologies are going to accelerate, hopefully, the destruction of some of those barriers. We're going to see organizations where people truly understand the business purpose and the technology that operates in there that are going to be the quickest to be able to automate these defensive capabilities. We're going to see organizations that control their own code from start to finish be able to do live deployments of code that maybe operates for an hour or 2 hours and then disappears. And I think we're going to see from hyperscaler world down to regular infrastructures these changes, right? Like we've seen Amazon and Google and Microsoft do microservices forever. That's coming for everybody in a future of AI, when you can just define, hey, I'm going to spin up this resource to meet this need, and then I'm just shutting it down. Why do I have it running, and why do I have this vulnerability open if it's not needed in this moment? So I'm excited to see we're going to enable the people across businesses and across the government who really understand what they're trying to do, being able to do great things. And I think that's where we see the accelerant that's going to be most beneficial, and where we're going to see, as Mike earlier hinted, towards organizational structures, where we can have a bias towards taking a human who can prototype something with one of these tools, a new defensive capability, a new resiliency capability, a new backup capability, and enable them to take that in like a go-to-market way, but federally. How do we take it from beta to enterprise technology in hours? Right now, for me to set up a website, it could take me 6 months with all the approvals. I have to go through, right? Like I have to go to OIRA, right? It's a morass of federal to get the most basic work done. We need to change that to hours, and as Mike's talking about the policy landscape, that is the challenge we're going to have to work through, and I think that's where we have a ton of opportunity to enable these fast tools by removing internal government regulations and helping our cyber defenders do their job.
And if I could jump in, one thing that we didn't mention yet on the panel is anything about pre-authorizing decisions, which I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the governance shift that we'll see. When I say that I'll give talks to kind of empower and cheer on the CISO community to say, like, this is the moment to make a big action, a big one is determining what does governance in the loop look like? What does a human in the loop model look like? This is not getting the right capability, turning it on, and then you can kind of walk away and continue the rest of your job. This is how do you really understand the mission well enough to be comfortable pre-authorizing certain decisions so that you can really work with your team to work as quickly as possible to close out vulnerabilities, but in parallel, you're actually working on that governance shift in the way that your team, your organization, your agency is thinking about how it can be comfortable with the risk it is accepting in a whole new world. And I think pre-authorizing decisions, making sure that you understand that governance model within capability set is so critical right now, and it's something that I don't think is being talked about enough, and I think that just having that at the forefront of conversations is really, really important.
That's a really good point, because I think that that's really taking advantage of the power of these models to sort of let them run free. But it is one of those places where we also have to think through how do we do model evaluation. And the government's working on this. Carnegie Mellon, where I teach, has a Software Engineering Institute, which is a federal FFRDC that is really expert in models, and they have the cert for AI, so they can house AI vulnerabilities. So when we're looking at model vulnerabilities themselves, they can bring them to a single place. But there is this question of, like, how do we understand how models behave, not just in evaluation, but in the wild, so that as those CISOs are pre-authorizing those decisions, if something goes awry, are you prepared to interrogate the decision-making of the model to understand what happened, to have it know when to come back, and how do you evaluate that? How do we not just rely on the vendor's claims of evaluation, but have those neutral third parties to be able to look at them across sort of the consumer reports of models, because there are American companies who are working on this, foreign companies who are working on this. Like, we need to be able to understand, enterprises need to be able to understand which models are better for which things, and we don't have that third-party evaluator ecosystem yet the way that we need to, and that's a really complicated thing, but it's something that I think is worth having the federal government invest in to make sure that we understand what these models do, what their strengths and weaknesses are.
No, absolutely, and I think that that's very much a theme that comes out in the report and the research that we've been doing here as well. Only because I could continue asking questions to you all day, I'm going to wrap up my two final questions into one, and then we'll take a rapid fire trip down the line. So we've been talking about, among many other things, the role of kind of public-private engagement, partnership around this set of issues, which I think is as important now as ever. So the first part of the question is, and maybe you can even choose if you want to take one or the other, what lessons from collaboration of the past in the cybersecurity space or the AI space should we be taking into the future? And then maybe on the flip side, are there things that we should be thinking about very differently? Just because I think the moment and the way that government and industry have been collaborating now, even in the development of policy, and we're talking about model governance, has already looked different in some ways. So lessons from the past that we should take forward, or ways we should be thinking about it differently. And then second question would be, looking ahead, if you all could predict 1 year into the future, what is a development that would make you feel confident that maybe cyber defenders are moving forward or are kind of moving toward gaining that advantage in this context? Maybe we'll start with you, Mike.
I think that maybe for the second part first, I think I'll be looking at trends in operational speed, in resiliency, in the way that workforce optimization can be done across federal government. I think those are really important metrics that we're already exploring. They've already been on the books for some time. It's more about how quickly we can turn things around to ensure that we are tightening those windows. Patch velocity is something that Jay's already mentioned, is very important in the way that we are looking at kind of the blocking and tackling and doing that better as we are on this road to AI and cyber defense. I think one area, just in closing, that has been really important for the past decade in the way that the federal government is considering its cybersecurity tool stack is a program like continuous diagnostics and mitigation, something that was built a decade plus ago to serve a similar purpose, kind of building foundational cyber defense at agencies where either none has existed, or there was no standardization, or there wasn't enterprise-wide visibility in a way that was needed. We're at a similar inflection point where we're seeing that many of those tools are still relevant, but the way that we're integrating and operating as a federal community has changed pretty dramatically. And so finding ways that we can tighten that circle of, or tighten that loop of identifying a new important capability that meets the mission and need right now into operations and into deployment to the federal agency is vitally important. I've been talking quite a bit about the fact that the federal government, as no one can right now, we can't wait to see what some other sector is doing before we jump into this. It's important that as NIST is working new guidance on AI agents and securing AI agents, as CSIS is working vulnerability management and exposure management efforts, we can't wait several years to turn that into policy. We can't wait several years to turn that into operational programming that allows agencies to reap the benefits of that guidance and see that in operations in their CIO and CISO shops. That has to happen almost immediately. So whenever I talk about the governance of an organization, of an agency, we're also exploring that as an enterprise, how the government can make sure that we are delivering the services and capabilities that agencies need to meet this moment.
Why don't I take the first one? Which is, there are a couple of lessons that I think we've learned in the past that are really useful for this application to AI. And one is where in the previous administration, NSA had stood up under General Nakasone the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, which was about private industry and government working together on cyber vulnerabilities, bringing all the capabilities that the government national security enterprise had to understand what adversaries were doing and having that conversation in an unclassified way with industry to really up-level our understanding of risk. And that is a thing that we should be doing for AI, cyber as well, like having that back and forth conversation between government, what government is seeing on risk and what industry is seeing on risk. The second lesson that I take away from my time in government is that when we think about who our trusted partners are, we really pushed hard to make everything in cyber Five Eyes, because we have very strong partners in the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand that have a similar understanding and capability to the United States. And when we think about who should have access to those models first, this move to say it's only US citizens really cuts hard against businesses that are having, green card holders working there or foreign engineers. We want to be the place where technology talent comes in the United States, but also when we think about who we are partnering with, ensuring that we are able to have that collaboration with our Five Eyes partners is so important.
I think I'll take the first question more so on what lessons from the past can be imparted into this current landscape. For me, it's about almost the Great Society and how we are creating a space by which everyone has access to the tools needed to better create outcomes for their future, whether it's education, healthcare, financial capability, you name it, at every juncture, at every space, at every level. And America has historically been a leader in developing those tools and creating the practices and the processes by which individuals can replicate those best examples. And I think that needs to continue. And we can leverage this current moment, AI and security by design, to really look at the overall landscape in a way that impacts everyone across critical infrastructure and really prioritize the investment in the right resources and tools to best impact their lives. And so that's what I'd want to see replicated. I know that it is big and lofty, but there's a way to do it, I think, with the right collaboration, the right resources, the right partners at the table, and making sure that we don't move away from those fundamental values that brought us here in the first place. And we can do that and lead and innovate and work together and continue to drive progress together for everyone.
Thanks so much.
So I'm not lofty. I'm going to be very brass tacks and very concrete because I think that helps explain where I'm seeing things. I will look at this in a year and I will say, we're doing a good job if two things are true. One, if as we're building AI tools, it is normal to connect them to dozens to hundreds of data sources as part of everyday business. Right now, there's a real risk fear about setting up an agent and having it connect to 3 data sources, let alone 10. AI gets smarter the more connections it's got. So it's going to get more effective the more places we plug it into, and figuring out how to do that so I can have agents plugged into dozens to hundreds of different data sources is going to be the measure of success in terms of the implementation of the technology. The second one, and this is going back to Mike's way earlier discussion of procurement, if every procurement specialist has a cowork or something like that on their desktop and he's using AI as part of everyday work, we're starting to do it right federally, right? It's not just going to be the top tier operators that need to use this. We need to enable the entire federal knowledge worker space with these tools. We need to allow them to automate the toil and goofiness of the federal systems to make those quicker, to make those better, so that we can all be more flexible in delivering this mission.
No, thanks so much to all of you. So we've got some high-level aspirational goals and we've got some tactical goals. So before we head into a next panel discussion that is going to get further down into the weeds of how we operationalize all of this, hope you all join me in thanking Mike, Mika, Nicole, and Jay.
Great. Well, our first panel set a really high bar. Not only sort of diagnosing some of the ways that AI is transforming cyber defense, but also actually getting into some of the operational issues that this panel will. But I have no doubt that we will meet or exceed that bar because we have two fantastic think tank scholars as well as two senior members of industry to really get into the nitty-gritty of implementing AI for cyber defense. So starting immediately to my left is Alok Mehta, who is director of the Wadhwani AI Center here at CSIS. And Alok has sort of done it all. He has a variety of perspectives, served at Google, OpenAI, on the Hill, National Economic Council, OMB, FCC, so brings a wealth of experience on these issues. We also have Carol Kuntz, who teaches AI policy at Georgetown and is also a scholar here at CSIS. There's been some discussion of our forthcoming report, which will be available this afternoon on some of these issues. And Carol was the lead author on that and also had a 30-year career at DoD, so knows that institution very well. And Patricia Eke leads Microsoft's cybersecurity policy efforts, focusing particularly on critical infrastructure and AI security. So that'll be a great industry perspective. In addition to Chris Cornelli, who leads cloud security policy at Google in their government affairs division. So I'm going to start with kind of a high-level question, but maybe kind of the most important question about what is the most important thing that we can do, maybe in the next year in order to improve the ability of AI to strengthen cyber defense. And there's a government side of this, and then there's an industry side of this. So I'd be interested in both. So what's the most important thing from your perspective, or the biggest barrier that we need to address, government and or industry, in order to capture this moment? I'll start with Alok.
Yeah, to me, it seems like the most important thing we have to do is figure out how to apply rapid patching. So if we're in a world where vulnerability detection becomes extremely fast, and we have models that are able to close the gap in detecting things like zero-day vulnerabilities, the real question is, how do we create the infrastructure to be able to not only create patches to vulnerabilities, but disseminate them to all the systems that we need to very broadly. And this is one of the real challenges, is sort of, you can have very sophisticated organizations that are very good about patching, but we have software that reaches very broadly throughout the economy. And so how can we ensure that those patches get to all the places where that software is used in a timely manner?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent insight. Carol?
I share the view that remediation or the rapid patching of problems is the issue. And I agree that, as we think about the companies that have participated in this preview program under the auspices of Project Glasswing and Daybreak, they have the access to these models, they have the time, and they have the technical sophistication to develop these patches. And I think the place where you're really going to have government and industry sort of catalyze effort together will be to assure that as we kind of move down the sophistication continuum, if you will, to users, to small and medium-sized businesses, to the open source community, and then I think particularly to critical infrastructure, to the end of my continuum might be a water utility using legacy software in a town kind of strapped for funds. These systems, these industrial control systems are very unique to the particular facility, and so the patches are probably going to have to be bespoke. They're going to have to be unique to the facility. So I think a real challenge will be to get the patches configured for those unique situations, get technical expertise, some funding, some urgency, so that the whole continuum of users are patched, which I think is the key thing.
Yeah, and Carol, you mentioned funding as one thing. Do you think that we have the existing sort of organizational structures and market incentives to do that, or do you think that we need sort of new mechanisms?
Well, I think the urgency of acting was one of the things that I think the first panel effectively conveyed. And I think it would be ideal if there could be some appropriations for the purposes of patching or assisting with the patching at nonprofit or not much profit institutions, not the high-end, hyperscalers, but, again, my posited water utility in the town, metaphorically and geographically far from Silicon Valley. So I would love to see additional funding. It is also the case, as those of us who've worked in government knows, that if OMB shakes out the pennies, as it is fondly called, you can find money for initiatives. So I do think that not for the hyperscalers, the technology companies, the cyber defenders, again, going down my positive continuum from the big private sector companies to the users, to the small and medium businesses, to the open source. I think you are going to need funding, and I think you're going to need an organized effort that makes the technical sophistication to deal with some of these issues available to these important but geographically and metaphorically far from Silicon Valley facilities.
Yeah, no, great insight. Patricia?
Thank you. I think the first panel really set the stage very well on the things that have been happening on the government side. As you all know, there was the Trump AI executive order that was released, and yesterday the USG-led clearinghouse, Gold Eagle, was announced. And so there are a lot of different initiatives that the government has initiated, and I believe that over the next 12 months, if we can move from strategy to execution, that would be a big win. On the private sector side, I believe my co-panelists have really nailed it. It will be speed in closing that attacker window, just really reducing the time between when vulnerabilities are discovered and when they are remediated.
Yeah, great points. But Chris, what have we missed? What's the single most important thing besides disseminating these vulnerabilities?
Oh, I don't have, I can't disagree with those points. I think it's really critical that we are putting AI in the hands of the defenders. Mythos class models are great, but how do we democratize access to these tools with the right harnessing, with the use of lower cost models? How do we harden critical infrastructure? You mentioned Gold Eagle. That's obviously an extremely important initiative. But there's also work that industry is doing, for instance, Project Acretes with the Linux Foundation, Athena, Lightwell. How do we speed resources to open source communities? How can we work with the SRMAs to speed information to under-resourced critical sectors? And then I think we also have to continue to share intelligence between industry and the federal government. Keep abreast of how adversaries are using the technology, and so that we can stay ahead.
Great. And focusing still on sort of operationalizing this, Chris, what are you seeing in terms of, AI tools and capabilities are broad, right? There's so much that's there. What are you seeing today that you feel like organizations can leverage very effectively? What do you see, coming down the road soon that we need to expect and prepare for? And what's further down the road that you feel like is going to take some time before we'll really be able to leverage it for cyber defense?
Thanks for the question, Matt. So I think, this stuff isn't science fiction anymore. Google, for instance, has been using AI in our platform defenses for almost a decade. If you're a Gmail user, you're taking advantage of machine learning to filter out 99% of the spam and phishing emails that are targeted at your inbox. I think there are more, kind of mundane use cases for this, right? Generating incident reports, save users time and toil. There are some really futuristic, very cool use cases that we're working with internally, right? Using LLMs to reverse engineer malware. Our team at VirusTotal has developed a tool called Code Insight that can look at a piece of code and tell you not just whether or not it's malicious, but exactly what it is, how it operates, and how you defend yourself against it. And if we are going to use AI to make our security more like an immune system, you have to be able to detect the threat to mobilize those antibodies. But I think the holy grail here is using AI proactively as the code is being written and compiled in order to prevent new vulnerabilities from being shipped to production code. So we've launched this tool called Code Mender. It's an autonomous patching agent. It works with a range of our models. We're using it internally. And the idea is it's kind of like a spell check for code, right? The developers use it, it patches the vulnerabilities, it gets validated, and we can ship that code, and our customers have a higher degree of confidence in that code. I think this is going to be really, really important, especially as more and more of the world's code is vibe coded, right? It's written through natural language.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really sort of operationalizes secure by design in a way that we have never been able to do before. So that's a great point. Patricia, what do you think is the most critical near-term opportunity or capability that we haven't already highlighted?
So I want to build on some of his points, and you heard the term harness on the first panel that we just listened to. Microsoft, we just released something called M-Dash, which is a multi-model system. So a lot of the conversations that we've been having and continue to have are focused on, okay, what can this model do? What can a singular model do? What's the capability of a single model? But where the future is really headed is using a lot of different models through a harness. So for example, M-Dash uses about 100 different models using agents that can use these models to do this different types of vulnerability discovery and validation and even remediation. And so that's it. While it is still a very new area, we have seen that in AI, the technology really moves fast. And I would say this is probably the area that we're likely to see provide a lot of benefits for cybersecurity defenders in the very near term.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on the point of sort of identifying and patching vulnerabilities quickly using AI, Carol, in your forthcoming report, you argue that it's not a matter of simply discovering these things, that you need that trusted process for validating, prioritizing, remediating them. So where do you feel like that chain is most likely to break down? Where do we need to do the work of improving?
Well, again, I think we've got we've had a lot of great comments underscoring how we really are at a change point in cybersecurity. And I think we have to recognize that and shift. We need to shift to seek to diagnose and patch particularly high priority vulnerabilities that these frontier models will be able to expose. And then the whole characteristic of cyber defense needs to shift to being sort of more vigilant, to be watching for vulnerabilities that are introduced by new code, and each of you spoke about programs to try to deal with that problem, and then also to detect attacks, and then to be able to swiftly, at machine speed, but with some either prior authorization of humans or through some oversight, be able to move at machine speed to remediate these problems. I think we've already previewed that I think the pace, I think the prospect of effective AI-enabled defense is there. I think it's remarkable how many tools have been developed by the high-end companies that would be able to, if incorporated into cyber defense capabilities across the whole spectrum of users that I was talking about, the whole continuum, that could be effective. But it's going to be a race. I mean, it's really going to be a race, and I think particularly for the non-high-end companies, we're going to have to sort of catalyze, incentivize, and in some cases pressure adoption of what's needed in this new era.
Yeah, and on the point of moving, there's been discussion of moving at machine speed. How do we have processes to integrate this quickly? Illik, how do you think about the role of humans in the loop in this process and where that's necessary? Is that just an operational issue, governance issue? Like, how do you think about getting our arms around that in order to be effective, where we're both doing this at machine speed, but also ensuring that we don't cause more problems?
I think that is really an evolving process, so something we're learning. We're learning about this in the cybersecurity space, we're learning about this in the agentic space. So as these tools get more sophisticated, they become faster. In certain circumstances, you do want AI tools to take at least some set of actions autonomously, as sort of the speed at which sort of cyber attackers and cyber defenders interact. That will probably increase, but to get to that point, we need to learn and have confidence in that these tools will act the way we expect them to act. We'll have to create infrastructure to be able to trace and log the actions that tools take so that we are able to understand what they did, and in cases where they don't behave as expected, we can take action to sort of make sure that they don't do that a second time. And I think all of this is an evolving process. We're learning over time, and there will be an evolution in terms of how much autonomy we are able to and willing to provide to AI tools, that we will start with relatively low levels of autonomy that we authorize, and we will gradually move up to more and more sophisticated, more autonomous systems as we become more confident in our knowledge of what they do and how reliable the actions they take are.
Great, and there's been some excellent discussion of the importance of both access and operationalizing these tools at, as Carol says, metaphorically and sometimes geographically, places and organizations that are not near Silicon Valley. I'd be interested in Patricia and Chris's reflections on, what do we need to do in order to make these tools genuinely not just give access, but actually be usable by those organizations? What are your lessons learned from working with them?
I can take that. I don't think the issue or the blocker is access. I think what we need to focus on is building expertise and capability. And so I know, Chris, you had noted Acritis, which is a Linux Foundation nonprofit that was recently established. And through this nonprofit, they will discover vulnerabilities, have a security incident response team with engineers staffing their response team, build fixes for these vulnerabilities and send to the open source maintainers, which write a lot of the open source code that underpins critical infrastructure. So this is an example where the open source maintainers don't have access to these AI-enabled tools or these frontier models, but they are benefiting through this type of industry-led coalition. So that solves sort of the upstream issue with helping remediate vulnerabilities in open source code. I'm very, I'm looking forward to seeing how things are operationalized through Gold Eagle, because in this situation, it should solve for the downstream problem where through this type of clearinghouse, those that have access to these frontier models and voluntarily agree to use the clearinghouse to also find vulnerabilities in open source and disseminate those fixes to critical infrastructure owners and operators. And as we know, we have 16 sectors that are part of critical infrastructure, and some of those sectors are under-researched, like your water, right, and your healthcare, and so they can benefit this way. And so this is one model that I think could be extended to supporting and building up expertise and capacity for small, medium businesses, under-resourced sectors or other stakeholders that don't have the access to the frontier models. And as we heard from the first panel, there's also the question on whether they can even use the access to frontier models. And so just think about a model where we can scale what those that have access, that we can scale the expertise and capacities that those that have access and transcend that to others.
Yeah, excellent point. So, Chris, I think we can't have this conversation without talking about the cloud, because those cloud services do broaden access to tools, AI tools that can be used for cyber defense. How do you think about the breakdown of what that accomplishes versus other things that organizations need to do in order to leverage AI to improve their cyber defense?
Thanks, Matt. So, I would tend to agree. We feel that the cloud is a powerful force motivator, and as an accelerant, as customers seek to keep pace with AI-assisted, vulnerability discovery. One of the powerful force multipliers for cloud is that we can take advantage of scale and centralized patch management. So if you're a cloud customer, all you need to do is sit back and allow us to push these security patches onto your systems with a high degree of fidelity and reliability. And this is going to help customers keep pace with that critical bottleneck, which is remediation. But I do agree that there's more that we can do to improve access to skills, and I think we've made a lot of investments in the Cyber Clinics Consortium, using universities as kind of a fulcrum for disseminating cyber expertise, especially in rural communities. But also just providing kind of the practical know-how of how to use these models, how to use harnesses. We launched an initiative in May called the AI Threat Defense Initiative, in which we provided a 4-step framework to help customers not only understand what kinds of tools they can use, Google and other tools, but how do they kind of like prepare the foundation? What do you need to prioritize? For instance, how do you limit your attack surface? If you're using 10,000 open source libraries that you have to maintain, how can you dramatically reduce those libraries in order to minimize the surfaces that attackers could potentially exploit? So we've put out a number of resources, but we're really excited to go out and engage federal partners, sector risk management agencies, state, local, territorial, and tribal, and try to get that knowledge out there.
Yeah, and picking up on the point about resources, Carol, I'd like to return to your observation about government funding, right? Which is critical, but also scarce. How do we think about, as OMB and kind of shakes the trees and finds funding, how do you prioritize? How do we actually get the most bang for our buck from the federal government on this?
Well, I think a lot of the comments this morning have underscored how in this remarkable moment of transition in cyber defense, it's required particularly close work with the private sector. The private sector is, particularly the high-end firms, particularly those in these preview programs, are developing very helpful tools. But we've already talked about how there's a whole continuum of users, and we're going to have a real challenge in making sure that some of the what I've called the not-for-profit or not-for-much profit sectors are adequately protected. I think one of the real roles that the federal government can and should play is to be a little bit of a clearinghouse to help the broader community assess where on the continuum of software enterprise users they're not covered. Small and medium businesses, they are. I agree with you. If they're using cloud compute, they're likely to be protected. There may be, though, I wonder a little bit as they attach to the cloud, are there any vulnerabilities at those juncture points? And of course, all of small and medium businesses are not using cloud. And so I think the federal government can play a useful clearinghouse, sort of catalytic role in working with private sector partners to kind of go through the whole list of users in terms of broad categories and assess where the principal vulnerabilities remain. And again, I echo my colleagues' observations that I do worry particularly about some of the critical infrastructure. If you look closely at the industrial control systems that power a lot of these utilities, they're almost always sui generis. They're unique to the facility. And so I celebrate the people who take the classes at the university, but honestly, if I was at the water utility plant, I might hope in this particular moment of vulnerability that maybe we could get some technical teams. I don't know if it'd be possible, it would be ideal if we could get them to go in and supplement, work directly with the IT managers on site, because otherwise we might have, as we say in DoD, some bad days in the future. So I think that kind of active role would be helpful.
Yeah, so those are great ideas on how to use the scarce resources. Look, there are a variety, beyond cost, there are a variety of challenges in terms of integrating these tools. Uncertainty, liability concerns, integration challenges, institutional inertia, right? Others that I'm sure that you've experienced. What are policy levers that could meaningfully address some of those barriers beyond just funding?
So one thing I think about a lot is that if you look at the history of how the cyber industry has evolved, we have seen spikes in insurance premiums when we've had a lot of data breaches. And I think that with the release of Mythos class models, we're still seeing it shake out, but we will see some pretty dramatic shifts in the insurability of corporate use of AI and new pressures for companies to adopt cybersecurity best practices as a way to ensure that they have appropriate insurance coverage. We've also seen that many insurance companies have sort of pulled back coverage of various AI-related uses. And so I think as we think about how this evolves, there's a role for government to play. And this could come in a variety of options, but some of those could be sort of thinking about various methods to backstop insurance as we see how this issue plays out in the corporate environment. Another could be to develop best practices that can really sort of anchor what companies do to ensure that they're meeting the minimum bar they need to make sure that their systems are secure. And the other is really to collect the kinds of information that are necessary to give tractability to insurance companies to be able to measure and manage and do the actual calculations they need to be able to provide insurance. And so I think that's one narrow piece of it, but it's something that we've been thinking about a lot.
Great, excellent insights. Obviously we can't have this conversation without talking about government procurement, also a critical area. And I'd be interested in Chris's view. Obviously there's a push and it's really important to really quickly procure and begin using these AI tools in the federal government. At the same time, this is so fast moving that you don't want agencies to be essentially like locked into today's tools and technologies as they evolve. So what are your thoughts on how you strike a balance or how you solve for both of those challenges?
Well, I think it's really important to enshrine these priorities in procurement using tools like capability-specific requirements as opposed to, that are more vendor agnostic, allowing flexibility, model choice, multi-cloud is very important for this. But also taking advantage of the levers that we've already created. For instance, government-wide procurement vehicles, the multiple award schedules, being able to allow more government actors around the country to take advantage of the economies of scale to use these technologies at a lower cost is very important.
Just wanted to second that, completely agree. Policy levels like procurement requirements should focus on security outcomes, which could be rooted in standards that allow for predictability and focusing on actually bolstering cybersecurity and that not locking, either agencies or the buyer into a specific either technological tool or vendor. And so keeping that flexibility while focusing on security outcomes is the way to go. And then I completely agree with you. Please don't No need to reinvent the wheel or create new things. We can leverage the existing mechanisms that we have today and then build on that, especially with all of the pipeline of work that NIST has right now in building out, developing different types of requirements and things. I think there's a synergy there to be able to combine those two things to drive some acceleration of AI adoption.
Great. And so we can't have this conversation today without discussing sort of access to these models in terms of release and the government's role in that. We've seen in recent weeks, changes in the administration approach and concerns about how the government is going to regulate these models. And so Carol's forthcoming report argues that we should both have pre-release review, as well as a broader sort of post-release evaluation ecosystem. So I'd be interested to look in, those are sort of two different activities. What would each of them accomplish? How do you distinguish the goals and capabilities from both sides of that equation?
Yeah, so when I think about how we approach sort of the pre-release activities, particularly the ones conducted by government, I think a lot about how can we leverage the unique capabilities and insights that government can provide that can inform the model development process. So in some cases, that might be that the government can develop a depth of technical expertise that might not be available for various reasons. We've seen the UK Security Institute do this with great success, develop really world-class technical teams that can engage in really sophisticated testing. But I think a bigger advantage, a bigger way to leverage the government's role in pre-release testing is through this combination of a lot of how we approach testing depends on the threat models we have about how AI technology can be exploited. And the government has information and intelligence that is it has more information and more intelligence in ways that are not accessible to industry. And so it is able to develop much more sophisticated and much more up-to-date threat models. So doing testing that's informed by those threat models using intelligence that's not available publicly or to companies is, I think, one of the advantages that the government has, and that's a really useful activity they can do during the pre-release period. The second is that they can really engage in testing using classified information, either inputs that are classified or testing for potential outputs that are classified. And they can work with the companies to figure out secure environments to do this in. And this is, again, I think testing that would be very difficult for industry to do in a really fulsome way just on their own. And so these, I think, combined allow for a much more robust picture to emerge about the potential really dangerous capabilities that models might provide and leverage sort of the unique insights that only government can provide.
Yeah, so Alok has laid out kind of a really critical role that government can play in this. I'd be interested in Patricia or Chris's perspective, because obviously we need to disseminate these models incredibly quickly. We need to do that not only to US companies, but to allies and partners. And if we don't do that, we're not going to have effective cyber defense. At the same time, pre-release review that's the new reality, right? And there are good reasons for that. So how do you think about the process of accomplishing both of those goals in terms of having effective pre-release review and working with the government, while also ensuring that we don't slow things down for companies like yours?
Well, I think it's really important to be able to provide transparency into our models, our capabilities, our safeguards. We have been working with the UK AI Safety Institute, with Casey in the US to provide that kind of transparency. We're also using our own internal benchmarks, our own frameworks, such as the Frontier Safety Framework, which provides a set of critical thresholds for when we would consider a model to represent potential safety concerns. And we're working within that ecosystem. I think, there are alternative models that could even be considered as well. We published a paper last week called A Pragmatic Approach to AI Governance, in which, we consider what if there were an independent FINRA-like entity that is able to do not just kind of voluntary testing, but also do these kinds of in-depth audits. Is that something that could bring additional, credibility and trust to this process? But overall, to your point, speed is really critical, and we can't fall behind. Jay on the last panel mentioned the progress in Chinese models. This GLM 5.2 model really underscores that we have to be able to bring these tools to market so that defenders can have the same access to the capabilities as our adversaries.
Yeah, no, really interesting proposal. I'd encourage folks to take a look at it. And also, would be interested, Chris, in zeroing in, because as you're working with Casey and the government on this, how do you think about and work with them on the information that you can realistically share? And information, obviously, we don't want this process to expose vulnerabilities. We don't want it to infringe upon privacy. Obviously, there are trade secrets involved. So how do you navigate that process most effectively?
I mean, I think this is obviously an evolving discussion that we're having with government partners. There's a role for the classified space, and so we're having those conversations with government partners. But I think we want to be able to have as much of this conversation out in the open as we can, to be able to learn from the expertise of Casey, to be able to incorporate some of their findings into our models as we're iterating and then putting them into the market. But it's an ongoing conversation.
I completely agree. It's an ongoing conversation, and I just wanted to note that trust and innovation don't have to be competing priorities. We also made an announcement where we are being transparent as well and working in collaboration with the US, with Casey and the UK AI Institute, AC. We are open to testing our frontier models with both safety institutes. And to respond directly to your question on what type of information can be shared, I think we can share enough information to aid security risk assessments, but balance that out to not share, to avoid sharing information that could create new risks. Because as you highlighted, they are, IP concerns, they are privacy concerns that we do need to keep in mind. But speed, I think, is the key, because if we want to continue innovating, we want to keep the process moving, I think having a very clear objective of the testing and evaluation, which is to, make these models available, use the insights that the government have, include the safeguards, and responsibly deploy and release these models in a quick way with that objective in mind, in a transparent way, is a model that could be used to move this process along.
Great. So that's public-private coordination specifically in the context of evaluating models, but there's the more broad question, which is that every cybersecurity strategy talks about public-private coordination and the importance of it. So Carol, I'd be interested in your paper and more broadly what you find about what areas are most ripe for effective public-private coordination and who should be responsible for convening it, how we can be most effective.
Well, it is critical in this area. As we've all been discussing, the government is essential, obviously, on translating national values with regard to, privacy of health data, privacy of other types of data, and other important values. I very much share the view, though, that the government needs to principally specify objectives or measurable security outcomes, particularly in rapidly advancing technologies, because government speaks more properly to these sort of values the robustness, the criticality of various things, and holding people to account, sort of assigning, characterizing the goal, and then assessing whether or not the goal has been met. And then I think it enables maximum area for innovation. I do think the public-private division is slightly different in the two areas we've been talking about. You know, one is catalyzing this fundamental shift in cybersecurity. And there, as I've talked about, I think you do need to have an active role as a clearinghouse, as a catalyst, as occasionally applying pressure and applying some resources in a targeted way to make sure that all the users as close or as far metaphorically from Silicon Valley are able to shift to this more robust cyber status. We were secondly, though, talking about this issue of monitoring and evaluating frontier models. And I think there we do need significant measures to enhance government capabilities to evaluate and to understand these models. I haven't looked at the FINRA structure specifically, but the report does urge that one of the things, in addition to increasing government expertise, that it creates an organization that can properly protect proprietary information, private information, but would have access to the algorithms, the model weights, and the training databases as needed to evaluate these models. Because some types of questions can only really be answered if you do have access to that kind of information. Obviously, they'd have to work closely with the private sector to set up that organization, and I'm open to alternative organizational ideas about how to do it, but I think that's quite important. And the report, as you know, also urges that there be significant increase in government and philanthropic funding for more research in academia with regard to these frontier models and also in non-governmental organizations. And I could talk more about the particular reasons why we think increases in the analytical capability at all three of those levels are important.
Great. No, that's super helpful. Excellent points. I'm curious, you know, as we're looking to some of the public-private cooperation that we've discussed in the case of the clearinghouse and pre-release review, and Patricia or Chris, what are your lessons learned? There have been various efforts at public-private cooperation in the past on cybersecurity, many of them predating AI. What did you learn in terms of frameworks that actually produce sort of operational results as opposed to just discussion?
Thank you for that question. From my experience, I believe public-private partnership works when you have an agreed understanding of the problem that needs solving and the objective. When you have that piece down, I think there's an equal investment and interest from both sides to get past strategy and go into execution. And that way you don't end up running around in circles and just having a bunch of meetings and then producing a report that just sits on a shelf and gets forgotten about. So I know I'm simplifying it a lot, but I really think when both parties feel like this is a problem that needs solving and the objective is clear, I think that's the foundational thing that's needed to move to action, whatever items that public-private partnership is set to accomplish. Obvious things are trust, transparency, collaboration, no siloed communications, ensuring that there is a transparent flow of communications between both sides, and genuine commitment to timelines.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with everything Patricia just said on public-private cooperation. You know, I think our experience has been, right, you need a shared understanding of objectives. Both sides need to kind of have skin in the game. I think we've been in environments before where that kind of public-private threat intelligence cooperation has been extremely important and valuable. And I'm remembering like the early days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when we're all trying to figure out what's going on and how do we make sure we're protecting critical infrastructure over spillover effects. I think it's also important to like keep in mind like what the scope is. Just because like this is working well how do we keep everyone, aligned and engaged and keep the scope manageable? But overall, I think everything she says is aligned with my perspective.
Yeah, so in terms of operationalizing this and sort of having that public-private cooperation and the government's sort of new and expanding role, I think that we need to have the conversation about existing institutions versus new institutions. Obviously, we've had Casey around for, I guess it's a couple of years now. We also have the intelligence community that is asserting a greater role in reviewing these models. Alok or Carol, how do you think about those institutions versus do we need new government institutions in order to work with the private sector and solve some of these problems?
I'm happy to chime in. I do think, and I do see sort of a lot of enthusiasm for Casey, for example, on the Hill, a proposal to sort of formalize and authorize and expand its funding. I guess I can be agnostic on whether we need a new institution. I think Casey is perfectly capable of performing a lot of these functions. What I do think is needed is sort of improved cooperation within government. So I think that what would be most useful is for there to be a single sort of arbiter or organizer that can provide a point of interface between industry and the government, where the job of this organization would be to corral the various resources that are available within government, not only in the intelligence agencies, but at organizations like the Department of Energy that have a lot of experience doing sort of testing for national security risks, and being able to sort of simplify the ways in which the private sector and the government interact, so that if I'm at a company, I don't have to interact with dozens of different agencies and try to figure out how to coordinate that information. And so that to me, I think, is what I really think about as being most critical.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea in terms of having a one-stop shop. That's something that's been done increasingly in space policy with an office in the Department of Commerce. Carol, I know that your report discusses this a bit, so anything to highlight in terms of your views there?
Well, with regard to the frontier models, I certainly concede the frustration of people coming to the U.S. government saying, I'd like to talk to the person who handles X issue, and getting a list of 15 people. So I acknowledge that as an issue. I do think a point that the report underscores, and I do think a critical issue, is we do need to immediately deal with this risk to cyber defenses. But I think we also need to start building the institutions that are able to deal effectively now, and as we look to the future, at evaluating these artificial intelligence models and their broader implications as they're woven into more parts of society. I think this issue of cyber defense is sort of the leading edge of that impact and should be dealt with in a very focused and discrete manner. But I think we do need to build more institutions that have technical expertise to evaluate them. I think within the field and outside of it, there's some, we don't feel like we've got the toolkit to really benchmark the performance of these models. We don't entirely know how, there have been useful comments made about agents. There's this increasing desire to use agents. There are real questions about how agents will interact with other agents. And we really need to understand all of that a lot better. Then obviously, as we look at other substantive domains, I think AI models are likely to have a very big impact. They've had huge impacts already in the life sciences, but there's still a lot of, even as there are a lot of operational questions, there's a lot of value-laden questions about the use of health data, the security of health data, who owns de-identified health data that's so important for research purposes, and then various issues that are properly vetted by bioethicists. And so that's why one of the things that the report calls for, looking beyond this immediate moment, which is quite important, is to start institution building. I do think it's important to build up the government expertise, and I've talked about our view that there's the need for a particular institution that can handle proprietary data in a responsible manner and conduct appropriate technical evaluations. I do think that we need to build up the funding that goes to academe. And particularly to have them have access to sufficient quantities of compute to really be able to do relevant research. I think this would particularly facilitate some of the cross-domain fertilization that's going to be important. There's a big question with generative AI algorithms about how you can anticipate the accuracy of fundamentally probabilistic models. This is, very challenging but important question. Apparently this question's been dealt with in other engineering disciplines, and I think having more research done in an academic context might enable this kind of cross-discipline fertilization. And I think NGOs with increased technical expertise might be able to play an important role in teasing out and maybe help we can have a more informed public debate where there are differences. I know that some of us are troubled, and certainly voters in New York are troubled by data center construction. And I think if we had a more technically expert folks at NGOs, maybe folks on both sides of the disagreement would be able to get more information. Why is the compute necessary? How could the rate structure be adjusted in a way that was perceived to be fair by both sides? More NGOs that have technical expertise might be able to I don't think it would resolve all the disagreements, but I think it would enable there to be a much more informed discussion. And in time, I think that we'd have more informed consideration of legislation that, as we look to the future, likely will be needed.
Great, and that's a great point. Our program, just to plug it, has done some work on data centers where we're really trying to find ways to satisfy that dual mandate, which is that we need data center construction, both for our economy and national security, but how do we address valid local concerns? We had an event recently, we're gonna be putting out a paper on that, and it's very much in many ways connected to these issues, right? Because ultimately, without that compute, you're not going to be able to leverage AI in order to improve our cyber defense. We're running out of time, but I would do just kind of a lightning round in terms of how we're gonna measure success or know whether we're gonna be successful in the next year. So if we meet again in a year, what evidence would you look for that we're actually meeting the moment in terms of shifting the contest in favor of cyber defense so that we can know if we're being successful? So I'd ask all the panelists.
I'm happy to start. So when I think about the impacts of AI on sort of the cyber world, I can think about sort of this vast corpus of existing software we have, as well as sort of software that is currently being developed. I think one of the metrics of success, if we've helped defenders, is if we've made a we substantially plugged away at the technical debt. We have patched and figured out how to patch a lot of the vulnerabilities in the existing corpus of software in a very significant way, so that in the future we can focus on figuring out systems and institutions and methods for dealing with potential vulnerabilities in newly developed software.
I would like to have no major breaches at financial institutions, which will principally be targeted by criminals, and no major breaches at, this critical infrastructure, electricity generation, water, which would be, I think, principally targeted by nation states. So very practical response.
That was actually the response I had as well. It's like, it would be great. I know, it's like, it would be great if there are no major breaches, of course, in our, critical infrastructure sector. But also the first comment I made when the panel started, I'd like to see a lot of the things that are being actioned through public-private partnership on the AIEO, actually move from strategy to execution. I know there's a lot of things that policy-wise efforts that have been started, so it would be good to see those things operationalized, implemented, lessons learned, and then we build from there.
I'll be, practical, pragmatic as well. I think we want to see the coverage of access to these models expand, right? So, what is the share of U.S. critical infrastructure that has had access and has scanned their code bases using models, both, frontier models, but also smaller fit-for-purpose models? What's the share of the maybe 500,000 critical open source libraries that have been scanned? What's the efficacy of the vulnerability remediation and triage and deduplication through Goldline, through the clearinghouse, Gold Eagle, sorry. I think we're tracking metrics like what is the mean time to remediate, right? We're watching AI models reduce mean time to exploit from, a few months to only, a few hours or a few days now. But how do we compress that remediation cycle? And if we're reducing that cycle, we're doing our job as well. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about in kind of the medium term. I think we all have to kind of sprint to get this right in the short term. But this is why we're having this conversation, and this is why we're closely engaged with our government partners around the world.
Yeah, I think Chris stole my closing because I don't know that I could do better than that in terms of having optimism, but some real benchmarks and ideas for measuring whether we're meeting that moment. So want to thank all of our panelists. This afternoon, we'll be releasing our report. We time these reports to be released for the event, and it makes a lot of sense, but we've also learned a lot today, and we're going to learn a lot today and in the coming days from folks in the audience and who are watching online. So we'll look to integrate those into the next phase of this, particularly just as we focused on really operationalizing some of these insights in order to improve cyber defense. So really want to thank the audience, both in person and online, for attending. So thank you.